think we still believe that China is determined to work in a way that stabilizes U.S.-China relations and not creates undue areas of friction and tension that can escalate in ways that are unpredictable and dangerous.
Let me push you little bit more
Sure.
on China. 2019, you wrote in Foreign Affairs with Jake Sullivan and called for the establishment of a framework, essentially to manage what you called a competitive coexistence with China. Recently, Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher wrote in that same journal saying that management of this relationship is folly and that our policy aim really should be outright victory over the Chinese. And that may mean working provocatively to create the conditions to get rid of the CCP. Have you changed your opinion?
So, look, I have enormous regard for Matt and Representative Gallagher, and Matt has actually given me great counsel. But I think one of the benefits of our system is that we have an ability to debate and to disagree. I would simply say if you read that article carefully and you look at the specific steps that both of them recommend in terms of our overall approach, not the outcome, and I understand what you're asking about the outcome, but if you look at the steps that they are laying out, they're almost identical to what we are doing already. And so I would simply say, with respect to the specifics of the constructions of elements of strategy, we are undertaking a policy which I believe shares broad bipartisan support, and I think that is the case. I would simply say that part of a strategy which is based on allies and partners, which our strategy is, working closely, not in a paternalistic way, but true listening partnership with countries that we regard as vital to our strategic purpose. It means listening to them. I think it would be fair to say that most of our partners and allies have different memories of previous policies of regime change in the United States. I think they would view those as largely unsuccessful, and they would be highly critical of an effort to depart along this path. Secondly, I think one of the things that I tried to write in an early article with my friend and colleague Rush Doshi was that for years we have overestimated our ability to fundamentally influence the direction of Chinese foreign policy or even the constructs of how it sees the world and how it undergoes its policy formulations. And so I think we have to have a high degree of modesty of what we think is possible with respect to fundamental changes in how China sees the world. And so most of our strategy that we've sought to develop, and I think this is the biggest difference, if I can say, is to construct a higher degree of confidence among like-minded states that we are determined to maintain elements of what I might call the operating system of Asia that we played a huge role in helping to develop, which has led to unprecedented peace and stability, innovation, and in some respects the 40 best years in the entire history of the Indo-Pacific. Now, sometimes Chinese friends refer to this as containment. We reject that. This is much more about sustaining an approach that we believe has been actually very good for all the countries in the Indo-Pacific, including China. And so that overall strategy is seeking to shape primarily our views and our policies in rather than seeking some sort of end game along the lines that Matt Pottinger and Representative Gallagher have laid out. I would say that the biggest difference between what I would call the Trump approach and the Biden approach is I think both were correct, and we give the Trump administration enormous credit for appropriately diagnosing the challenges that we were facing from China. But I think the primary approach that the Trump administration followed was a go-it-alone foreign policy. Very suspicious and sometimes very negative on allies, lots of threats about pulling forces out and major economic steps against countries that we're working closely with now. And so I think the biggest innovation of the Biden presidency has been working much more closely with allies and partners, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but linking those efforts with Europe. For instance, if you look at some of the biggest supporters of Ukraine, they are found in the Indo-Pacific. That's a remarkable achievement. And I think those patterns and habits of cooperation have been significant, and many countries in the Indo-Pacific would say quietly this is probably the golden age. And so I think the biggest difference between sort of a Biden and Trump approach is not this question about end games, because I think that's an exaggerated aspect of our what is possible, but more in the tactics. And I think our determination to work with allies and partners does stand in some contrast with some of the go-it-alone, America first approaches that we've seen discussed more recently and were put on display during his time in office.
So just briefly, Secretary, do you find the debate over regime change itself, is that productive or is it reckless?
Look, I would venture to say that I think that element at this time is reckless and likely unproductive. I do think we need to accept China as a major player, and that doing constructive diplomacy with them is in American strategic interests, and that there are a number of areas that frankly, we are destined and determined that we need to not necessarily work together. We don't have that much with respect to habits of cooperation, but aligning our policies, understanding what the other is doing, can be stabilizing. And so I think that's where I would put most of my focus. I would also say that the world is dangerous and unpredictable enough right now, with a raging war in Central Europe, with uncertainties in Gaza and Israel, the challenges in the Red Sea, major famines in parts of Africa. If you add all of those things up, it is a major test for American foreign policy. And I do not believe it is in our interest at the current juncture to add to our list. Let's try to topple the other leading power on the global stage, despite our differences. I do think at the current juncture it makes more sense to both prepare, be capable with allies and partners, send clear signals of areas where we have red lines and concerns, but also do what you can to coexist in a manner that does not compromise our interests or the interests of our allies and partners.
Hi, Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. You talked about calls for regime change in China as reckless, and I understand that stability is the focus. But in the long run, is the new world order that Xi Jinping envisions, is it possible to coexist with the current rules-based international order?
We have coexisted with other systems or other approaches before. This is not unique to us. I think the most important steps that we can take are developing stronger partnerships with like-minded states, building more capabilities domestically in the United States. That means investing in technology, rebuilding elements of our military supply chains, and basically developing the essential lines of communications of trust and confidence with allies and partners. I believe those are the fundamental steps. And so my primary answer to you is to focus more on the constructive steps that we would take among the community of nations that are determined to sustain elements again of this operating environment that we believe have been so beneficial to the countries of the Indo-Pacific more directly. And I think I'll just rest on that, and I think that's our overall approach going forward. I will say that U.S.-China relations are going to be challenging under the best of circumstances, right? And this gets back to the good question about, like, I think the difference between, say, the United States and the Soviet Union, previous periods of interaction with other countries, it would be hard to describe two countries that have as much interdependence as the United States and China. And so the interesting thing is that not only is our independence quite deep and profound, but it runs both ways. So it's very hard for China to take certain steps without harming its own economy. And I think we now understand that economic performance is central right now to what is important to President Xi. I think it is also the case that not only are we deeply connected and share interdependence, it is also the case that both countries are uncomfortable with many elements of that interdependence. We focus primarily on the U.S. role, what we're doing in terms of small yard, high fence, and we tend to overlook that in many respects the driving force of trying to create a degree of sort of economic exclusion and reverse areas of vulnerability with some of the speeches that Xi Jinping has talked about, dual circulation and making other countries more vulnerable to China more directly, that it is China that is driving some of these areas. I think the hope will be that we'll be able to settle on certain things that are necessary for the sustainment of the global economy, that are unexceptional with respect to national security, but at the same time create more, we're going to need to create more redundancy in the global system, more generally, more sources of supply for everything that's important. That is a challenging task in and of itself. We're in the midst of that now. Ultimately, that requires both strengthening, extending, and also careful coexistence. And that's really the nature of the diplomatic challenge that we have in front of us. It is one of the most difficult challenges in the history of American foreign policy.